honored to be here today among peers and professionals. And as far as Expeditors goes, we're probably the biggest company you've never heard of that's in your backyard. We have 16,000 people worldwide, and we provide supply chain solutions in virtually every aspect of a supply chain you can imagine. Oh, sorry. I have a problem. I move around when I talk. I teach a lot, and so I move around. And so we're honored to be here, especially with an opening ceremony like this of the Applied Research Center here in Seattle. Our company was founded here in Seattle over 30 years ago, sort of at the nexus of the outsourcing craze. Right? As soon as manufacturing was moving overseas, those goods needed to be moved back to the U.S. for distribution to customers, and that's where we got our start. And so we're happy here to be based in Seattle, thriving here, and to be a part of this day. And so this is not my presentation. Thanks. No, that's not me. But while they pull it up, how many people are actually in the engineering program here, in the supply chain program, or graduated from it? Okay, quite a few. You're embarking on a tremendous field in decision analysis. What I do now for Expeditors is I'm a global supply chain consultant for our Network Solutions group. And our mission, like was introduced, is to improve the performance of customer supply chains. And to do that, we use advanced mathematical modeling, theory, simulation, everything that's out there, everything that's on the boards back here, we use, right? But a lot of that theory runs into problems in actual business case. And so what I'm going to talk today about are challenges in the global trade, but I call them the new norm. For people who've been in the logistics and supply chain world for a very long time, these factors are the same that have been around 10, 20, 30, 40 years ago. They haven't changed. What has changed is the rapidity of change. Information is changing the way consumers have to operate in terms of getting product to you in the right quantity, in the right place, at the right time, but also make money. And that's very hard for manufacturers to do right now, manufacturers and retailers. So what I'm going to talk today is how these factors play into behaviors and how those behaviors meet industry gaps in terms of capability and knowledge and technology that are posing trends and challenges that a center like this can help work on. Right? Real problems that can really impact how not just the biggest companies in the world solve problems, but the small and mid-sized companies that can really use the kind of brain power that's in this room and the kind of knowledge that this room can bring to the table. So what is a best-in-class supply chain? In theory, it's pretty easy. It's very easy to manage a supply chain in theory. You're in charge of three flows: money, material, and information. And those three flows are critical between moving everything from supply and demand and keeping everyone informed about the flow of goods. To do that, you're going to optimize three things: network, the physical layout of your supply chain, where are your manufacturers, where are your distributors, where are your customers, and how are you going to align all those optimally to move them in the most efficient way possible. Processes. Do you have processes in your organization that support your network to produce the right outputs given minimal inputs? But then inventory. Is your inventory balanced in the right place at the right time to meet demand with preventing stockouts? And to do that, you're going to leverage enablers. So you're going to leverage your talent, your technology, your measurement, your innovation in your organization to achieve your corporation's desired outcomes, such as optimal cost and agility. And to do that, you're going to manage and leverage those to achieve those optimal outcomes. And in theory, this is very easy. However, as we said in the Marine Corps, the enemy has a say. The best laid plans fall out the window on first contact. And in our world, that's global trends and challenges, right? Continuous and evolving, right? They may be the same, the themes are the same, but how they're manifesting themselves today are different and faster. So I'm going to talk about some drivers of behavior that the customers I work with are facing, right? I felt that coming in and talking to you just about these factors would be a disservice, right? What I want to talk about is how these factors are driving behaviors in organizations and problems that need to be solved. And a lot of these problems don't have the brain power in this room to solve them. So we'll talk about some macroeconomic trends, supply chain disruptions, the changing consumer requirements that we've talked a little bit about already this morning with omnichannel fulfillment, and then technology. Then talk about some industry gaps, some gaps in capability that are desperately needed to really resolve and move the organizations forward so they can truly leverage their supply chain as a competitive advantage. Some trends and challenges that I see with my customers. Over the past 2 years, I've probably done several hundred projects for customers and engaged with hundreds more on consulting engagements and advice that doesn't even involve a project. And across industries, across company size, the problems companies are facing are virtually the same. I say every project's different, every problem's different, but the themes that underlie that problem are virtually the same. And so we'll talk about some of the trends and challenges that these problems are forcing companies in different areas to explore. And then some challenges that's posing. And then some areas for innovation. So what are some takeaways here, sort of a call to action that an institute like this could take and move forward with for applied research? So macroeconomic trends. Competition's increasing, right? And competition's not increasing because there's more companies out there, but because the information between companies is fierce. Near perfect consumer information is driving behaviors where a cost of a stock out or the time from when a customer walks in to look at a product and then leaves and that sale's lost is almost instant. We talked about it earlier with Best Buy, companies shopping, going and comparing prices. You can do it almost instantaneously. And this is causing retail and consumer-driven organizations panicked because they don't have, in a lot of cases, the capital to meet those challenges. In addition to increasing competition, we have rising wages. Well, rising wages currently, especially in China, are forcing companies to look farther and farther and farther to reduce the cost of goods sold. Their inputs, materials, labor, operations, energy, all those inputs are rising in cost. So profit-seeking corporations keep moving farther and farther away from their customer to try and make those returns that they're required. Taxes. Taxes are high in Western countries, and they're constantly causing companies to reevaluate their network footprint. Where do we have distribution centers? Where do we have manufacturing? Where do we have importer of record agreements and other entities so we can bring goods into those nations? These are constantly informing how supply chains operate and the footprint. And then regulations. I'm not a regulations expert, but all of my customers are dealing with increased regulations. The cost to do business is going up, but the cost to be uncompliant is virtually catastrophic. Right? The regulations imposed on carriers and shippers because of lithium-ion batteries, safety of life at sea, counterterrorism protections, all of these are adding incremental costs to each shipment. And if you add incremental costs to each shipment for millions and millions of goods and millions of shipments, it adds up quickly. So customers are faced with these rising trends. In addition to certain rising trends, there are trends revolving global uncertainty. Global uncertainty in terms of oil prices. Oil prices are causing shippers to constantly reevaluate their carrier base and seek new carriers at lower prices, but this could also disrupt the flow of goods that they currently have. It could seriously disrupt their supply chains. Interest rates. Interest rates have been low for a very long time. Companies had no problem carrying millions and millions of dollars of excess inventory because it was virtually free to finance that. Now, with interest rates rising, companies are reevaluating their inventory strategies. So what is that inventory strategy going to look like when you combine it with omnichannel demands, which we'll talk about later? Consumer demand. While it's been rising at low rates here in the US, it's been booming around the world. China's experienced significant growth in terms of consumer demand. But like we talked about earlier, as those jobs are moving farther and farther south, they're starting to lose their wage. Their wages are going down and they're becoming uncertain in ways they haven't been before. So consumer demand globally is unpredictable right now. And political instability. So all of these uncertainties are driving short-term decision making. Companies aren't necessarily investing right now in high-tech supply chain technology. It's just not happening because of low return. They're also looking short-term in terms of how do we make the next quarter? How do we improve on the margin 2 to 3% rather than investing in transformative change that 3 to 4 or 5 years from now could bring significant cost savings or reduction or improve service to customers, right? So these are driving short-term thinking. And on top of that, you're going to talk about supply chain disruptions and risk. I say that a supply chain manager manages in 4 dimensions, primarily. Distance, complexity, risk, and then underneath all of this is time, which is always compressed. So you have these 3 to 4 factors that are weighing on every single decision in a supply chain. So we increase complexity very quickly in this example. So if I have 2 regional manufacturing centers that ship through 4 ports at a national level, that then ship internationally to 7 ports, to then support a multinational distribution strategy to reach retail and e-commerce, I'm exponentially multiplying the amount of flows that are present in this system. It becomes almost unwieldy and impossible to manage through one single system. This is why there are hundreds of thousands of people working in the supply chain profession trying to manage the complexity of this. But more importantly, get information from all of these different areas to bring to a point to make decisions about, which is also very challenging. And then on top of that, you have risk in supply chain disruptions, port strikes, hurricanes, military coups in Istanbul this year, and Brexit. So this is what supply chain managers have been facing this year alone. I started one project for a customer who is heavily impacted by the West Coast port strikes. Their freight was held up, and they're looking for ways to expand. So they're saying, hey, what are some East Coast options to bring freight in from China? Okay, let's look at that. In the middle of that, then they were like, well, we can't worry about that project right now because I have to go back and deal with the hurricane situation that's happening. So we're going to put that project on hold so I can fight fires here. And then on top of that, their plans for European distribution were almost virtually destroyed once Brexit happened. Because now their plan was, I can go to one place in Europe, set up shop, and we're good. I can reach all the markets there just as they're one. And now UK is going to be a completely different entity. The free flow of goods, people, and information across those very narrow borders is completely changed. So that upended in one short time period the best laid plans that they had going. And so it turns from a strategic view to just fighting fires to get through. And so these are all the challenges that are faced every day within global supply chains. And as we keep moving farther and farther and farther from our sources of, from our customers to find those sources of supply, this is just going to keep growing. Right? These are the challenges faced every day by my customers. And these disruptions aren't going to go away. Here I just have a quick list over the past 6 years, a list of some of the major disruptions that occurred in supply chains that have caused drastic, not only changes in flows, but loss in capital, equipment, stockouts, inventory that have impacted multiple companies' supply chains. These are not going to stop. These are sort of a fact of life. These are all things that are going to have to be wrestled with. So if that wasn't enough, right, just let's manage dealing with the day-to-day world we live in. On top of that, you have omnichannel changing the fundamental structure of the logistics network. Our demand for things right here, right now, is good for us. It's fantastic for us. It's terrible for companies. Terrible. Because they're trying to figure out how they can still make money. They're trying to figure out how not only they can make money, but grow. And so this just came out in the recent CSCMP State of Logistics report. Inadequate infrastructure and the accelerating demand for last-minute home delivery will tax a system that is not designed for e-commerce. It's fundamentally not. And our last talk about the last 50 feet highlights that. It talks about this challenge to wrestle with meeting your consumer demands in a very expensive way that you're not willing to pay for, right? That's the key thing. You're not willing to pay for it So they have to find other ways to cut cost. And where do they cut cost? Anyone? Supply chain. Supply chain pressures are not going to go away. Right? We're not going to make significant investments in supply chain when if you look at the return on that. Right? Fiscally, the return on supply chain investments are very, very low. Right? So customers are now looking at how do we completely change our operating model to support omni-channel in a logistics environment that is completely not compliant and cost prohibitive. So if we're to look at today, currently, we deliver by truckloads. We leverage economies of scale and mass on big lanes. In the future, we're going to have door-to-door parcel or smaller. Very small, very labor-intensive shipments that are expensive to process. It used to be fully stocked stores, right? You'd go to the store. You were the last mile fulfillment. In that guitar story, that was a perfect example, where as he looked for the guitar, he was the last mile fulfillment. Now, retailers and manufacturing organizations are trying to figure out how they can go to a global customer base when they don't have representatives there, right? If you're going to ship from U.S. to Africa, and you're not a distributor, or you don't know anyone there, to reach that market, you have to then open up importer of record there. You have to maintain an entity there to do business. This poses more complexities in terms of tax, regulations. And so now to reach a globally distributed customer base is going to be very difficult. In warehousing, case pick and pack. A lot of warehouse operations are geared for large in, large out, move them to retail stores, or move them to further distribution centers. It's not our problem. In the future, it's going to be single unit pick and pack. How can a company make money shipping one tube of toothpaste to your house unless you're willing to pay $30 for it, right? They have to come up with innovative ways to do that. And innovation is a function of education. It's a function of knowledge. And a lot of companies are challenged with how to wrestle with this. Maybe not the Amazons of the world, maybe not the Ubers of the world, but those are only a couple companies, right? There's a tremendous well of opportunity in small to mid-sized companies that are dealing with these problems that need the kind of experience, knowledge, and energy that this kind of center can bring to the table. And then finally, centralized inventory. Moving on those economies of scale through big lanes to centralized inventory centralized inventory locations, moving to a completely decentralized inventory. Now, instead of having 4 or 5 distribution centers in the U.S., a project I just worked on for a company was, how do I get to every company or to all my customer base within 2 to 3 hours? My answer was, well, you need to have inventory everywhere in the U.S. That's the only way to do it. And on top of that, you're going to have to figure out how to get that cut, to process that efficiently, get it out the door, and deliver it within that time period. So not only do you have inventory positioning, but you have order cycle time problems you have to wrestle with as well. So on top of all of this, we have a technology gap, right? So we have an omni-channel technology cycle. And this is sort of what I've seen with my customers, is that the rapidity of change erodes competitive advantage, which sounds kind of counterintuitive, except once you realize not every single company in the world is high tech, right? Not every company is bringing in the best and brightest minds to solve these wicked problems that we have on the boards back here. And so what companies are seeing is that the e-commerce creates a need for speed, right? And not to quote Top Gun, which I just did, but it's creating a need for speed. And that speed is driving an intensely capital-intensive investment in automation. So to maintain the speed, you have to have efficiency, right? To maintain the efficiency and the margins required to stay in business. And to facilitate that efficiency and automation, you have to have almost near perfect inventory accuracy across all of your facilities. Maintaining inventory accuracy is extremely hard, labor intensive, and software intensive. So you have to have real-time data that supports all of this. And on top of that, you have to have connectivity, not only within your organization, but your consumers and your partners. So you have to have dynamic relationships to support this omni-channel world. And the speed is just increasing. The speed is just increasing. And so what a lot of companies are now saying is, I can't do this. I can't. We're out. We can't keep up. We're too big to shift and pivot to the way the market needs. So a lot of companies are saying, we can't do fulfillment anymore. We'll talk about that in a minute. So on top of all this, you have macroeconomic trends that are driving certain behaviors. You have uncertainty driving short-term thinking. Then you have a complete shift in how we buy goods. It's taxing a system, a logistics system that's not capable of handling it. And so on top of that, you then have gaps. You have gaps in capability. And probably the things I'm going to talk about now are what we all see in the organizations we work in every single day, right? One of the biggest gaps is supply chain strategy does not equal corporate strategy. In a lot of cases, in the first engagement, when I sit down with the customer, I say, so what's your supply chain strategy? And they go, cutting costs 10%. I'm like, that's not a strategy. That's a panic mode, okay? What's your strategy? What do your customers need? And they can't articulate it. And that's a problem. Because what has to happen is your supply chain strategy has to be linked with your corporate strategy. You have to know where the company is going so then you can align all of your vast resources in your supply chain to become a competitive advantage. And this was related to the example I just gave. There's a significant difference. And I hate to throw this one out here, but this is by far the most eye-opening thing that I've experienced. Big data, analytics, Internet of Things are only buzzwords for probably 99% of the companies out there. You read it, you read industry articles, you read industry magazines, and this is popular, it's hot, it's going on everywhere. And then you go into organizations that should have this stuff figured out, or maybe even wrote articles about this that you're now dealing with. And these are the farthest things from the truth, right? So these things are just buzzwords. And so when we're talking about data and understanding data and using it to make decisions, part of the reason these things are only buzzwords is because the people in charge of making decisions a lot of times aren't capable of understanding the data to help use it to help make decisions. And the people supporting are disenfranchised with the quality of data. All data is imperfect. I've yet to meet one customer who has tremendous data. There's always problems, but you have to go forward and make use of what you have to help inform decisions. And part of the reason big data analytics are only buzzwords is because of fragmented supply chain data. So across that example of the global supply chain I just showed you, to piece that together, there's probably hundreds of carriers in different locations working on different systems, all feeding in maybe to an ERP system, but mostly the information and data is being transacted on Excel spreadsheets or emails or orders, right? It's not an efficient way. So if you're now faced with a position where you have to take data to make a decision, you can't get it. And by the time you do get it, the decision is already gone, right? So in that project example I gave before with the customer who was looking to reinvest in other ports in the US when a hurricane hit, by the time we actually had data to answer the first question, it was too late, right? You're already well beyond the point where it matters, right? So we see a lot of fragmented supply chains with no actionable information, right? So I can't take all this data and do anything with it. And there's a tremendous focus on incentives within supply chains that are often disjointed within supply chains, but across entire organizations, where procurement is incentivized very differently than distribution or transportation. And the focus on segment goals really impacts how the company can move forward. So if you're all working on a different sheet of paper and you're all rewarded by different things, you're not going to get to the same place, right? And a lot of times incentives are at odds. So we see a focus on segmented goals instead of ecosystem goals. I really don't even like the term supply chain because it focuses on a linear flow of information, goods, and money. In reality, it's not. It's this big, messy conglomeration of suppliers and manufacturers all over the world, meeting customers all over the world. It's more of an ecosystem where understanding not just the linear flow of things, but understanding the interactions between the systems is what's most important. So understanding how your procurement works, understanding how your distribution works, transportation works, is probably the best strategy you could have in terms of achieving supply chain as a competitive advantage. And then talent management. And hopefully programs like this can really address that gap that was mentioned earlier in terms of supply chain talent that can relate the complex and often dirty world of logistics to people who have never experienced it, who are not from supply chain logistics. Right? They're from sales, they're from ops, they're from marketing, but they're making decisions that impact supply chain. Right? So we have a talent management problem where a lot of times people in supply chain positions of leadership are the best of what's left. Right? They're the ones still standing after 30 to 40 years, but they may not, it's not that they're for lack of energy or talent, they just may not have the education to deal with the problems facing modern supply chains. So there's a talent management problem. So all of these things are driving and manifesting themselves in different ways. So all of my customers, all of the customers probably in the world are dealing with these exact same problems. And so when I engage with customers on, all right, what do we do next? Facing these set of problems, facing these uncertainties, facing rising costs, how do we move forward? Well, a lot of times they come to the table with options they feel they need to pursue. So here's some trends, and then on the flip side, some challenges that as professionals and practitioners of supply chain, we could help solve. So short order to delivery cycle times. We've talked about this. Omnichannel is fueling it. And it's not just about transportation. It's about receiving the order, processing it, shipping the order, and getting it delivered. All of that's involved. Well, it's not just about that. The challenge is, let's not look at how we get freight in the best way from point A to point B. It's really about network design, which is asking, are point A and B the right places? Are point A and B correct? Sort of throwing the constraints off what you have and then moving forward. Lots of data, little actionable intel. So we need to link supply chain data to business cases. Origin distribution, where companies, especially in retail, are saying, how do I keep my goods closest to the point of manufacturer so I can reduce costs at origin and expensive transportation costs to the US. So now we need to figure out how to link real-time inventory to sales and operations planning. Outsourcing distribution and fulfillment ops. Once a core component of almost every organization is now becoming, because of omnichannel, something that's too big to bear. Right? We need to focus on higher returns. So if you're a supply chain manager, what are some of those high return functions we need to focus on? For the high-tech industry, it's virtually the opposite of retail. High-tech companies are saying, how do we reshore or nearshore back to the US or Western markets? Because we realize the cost of disruption is too great. Well, if you do that, you can't operate in the same model you had if you were manufacturing in China. So what are the new locations we need to be in? What are the new ports? What are the downstream and upstream impacts we have to wrestle with to deal with nearshoring? A lot of companies, because of e-commerce, are saying, I want to capture the margin I give up to my distributors. So how do I go from my manufacturing organization, which is often a contract, directly to the customer, right? In a company that may have never had a sales team that deals with end-to-end customers or e-commerce platforms. So then you have to figure out how to link S&OP with logistics in a real-time way. And then for some companies, it's, I got to cut 15%. That means half my staff has to go. So I'm now in a position where I have to completely outsource my logistics functions. And so what the supply chain manager is then left with is, how do I manage the relationships and network performance of all the carriers that I now have, or all the third parties I now have that manage my supply chain? Because I'm short on time, here's some of the things that are needed. Agile supply chains that take risk measurement, create mitigation plans, and then marry those with actionable intelligence. These are the things that can reduce the risk of operating in a globally distributed market. Professionals that can take their supply chain, transportation, and logistics data information and develop business plans. Develop business plans and develop business cases for investments in this area. This is probably one of the biggest and hardest things to do, is convince senior leadership of a company to invest millions of dollars in a low-margin supply chain effort. And it takes a lot of effort. So how do you take components of all these boards we have up here, take the key learnings and distill it into a business case to help the company to make and sell more? Upstream planning and engagement to reduce downstream costs. Shift focus from operational problems to strategic ones. It's more of a, we got to get out of the warehouse floor and move into the boardroom. We need to be a part of these big discussions going on with sales, procurement, and demand planning to ensure that our supply chain capabilities are right now and right in the future. And really, that's it.